everyone. My name is Pranav Anmulya. I belong to Faculty of Law and Governance. Today we will talk about Cicero. So Cicero, he's a statesman, belongs to Rome, scholar and reputedly Rome's greatest legal orator. Is said to have given the West and the basis of philosophical vocabulary. His major contribution to jurisprudence rests upon his concept of nature as providing a source of rules by which man ought to live. So he wrote a book basically, De Legibus, wherein Cicero examines the basis of law. To him, law is the highest reason implanted in men and commanding that which we ought to do and prohibiting the opposite. The highest form of reason which may be discovered in nature becomes when firmly rooted in human mind and further developed law. So law is a standard by which justice and injustice may be measured. Then he talks about true law. True law, that is eternal law, came into existence simultaneously with the divine mind. It is in essence reason in agreement with nature. It applies to all men and is unchangeable and eternal. To curtail the true law is unholy. To attempt to amend it is illicit. To repeal it is impossible. We cannot be dispensed from it by any order of any institution, nor does it require clarification or interpretation. So Cicero believes that true law is universal, and there are those who will obey the true law, and there are those who will disobey the true law. By such act, they turn their backs on themselves and indeed on man's very nature. They will therefore pay the heaviest penalties by denying their nature, even though avoiding those other punishment considered appropriate for their conduct. So, with this, we come to the conclusion of Cicero's state. So, Cicero's views of origins and functions of a state is to be found in his treatise De Republica. At the basis of creation of state is man's instinct to associate with others. Now he is, in Aristotle's phrase, a political animal who can fulfill himself only within society. He who is unable or unwilling to live in a society is a beast or a god. In coming together, men give evidence of a deep instinctive desire to form communities. For the human race is not of one solitary wanderers. This desire is, as per Cicero, the origin of the city, and indeed the very seedbed of this state. Now, men's coming together involving in an act of partnership which can be weakened or destroyed by a tyrannical state. So, where a tyrant rules, the state in its very essence, in its reality, is non-existence. So, the importance of Cicero in jurisprudence is that he belongs to natural law and he is the one who created so many rules. So, he gave importance to the rules, and he is somebody who basically talked about law in the nature of reason. And when there's something called highest reason, and that highest reason is situated or fixed into man's mind, then that highest reason in association with man's mind is equals to law. This is what Cicero's thesis about law. Now with this we will move towards Western tradition, further Western tradition, and now we will talk about Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau. Now before talking about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, let's talk about social contract. Now, theories suggesting a compact between rulers and ruled may be found in political and legal thought over the centuries. Now, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau were among those who developed the theory of social contract. Now, the essential features of social contract are such. So, in primeval times, individuals were born into a state of nature which was generally anarchic. Now, man's natural reason and his innate need to live within society led him to create a society by contracting with others. And the essence of the social contract was the surrender of some rights and powers to a sovereign in the expectation that he would safeguard individuals and protect them against oppression. The sovereigns to whom powers were transferred did not necessarily consider himself as a party to a contract. Now, with this, we will look Hobbes' social contract. Now, basic to Hobbes' philosophy was his belief that man is dominated by the instinct of self-preservation. Persistence of this instinct is evidenced by his reaction to the primeval condition of life, which led to an intensification of his efforts to ensure survival. Now, before the emergence of civil society, man lived in a state of nature in which all were equal and all had the right to act so as to ensure survival. But the strife was rarely absent. The most frequent reason why men desire to hurt each other arise because they wanted to survive. Now, this continuous clash of wills produced a war. This war, as Hobbes say it, of all against all. So, this continuous clash of wills produced a war of all against all. Events which assisted survival were good. Those which threatened survival were evil. There could be no ordered community in these circumstances. Because there was no society, continual fear and danger of violent death, and man's life was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It became obvious that individual survival might be more assured in peaceful conditions. Now, eventually, men, wishing to end an intolerable state of affairs, were ready to make a compact among themselves. Each would surrender his right of governing himself to some person or assembly, on the vital understanding that others would surrender similar rights in the same manner. Now, sovereign authority would have an absolute power to govern. In no sense was the sovereign a party to the contract, nor was he subject to those who had contracted among themselves. Now, what could be the legal implications of Hobbes' doctrine? Now, total obedience to an absolute sovereign power is the essence of Hobbes' version of social contract. A law is, in reality, the command of that sovereign power and requires an unchallenged ability to enforce it. Remove that ability, and the covenant becomes mere words. Now, a good law should not be seen as the equivalent of just law, because a law made by the sovereign cannot be unjust. When the sovereign enacts a law, he does so as though all his subjects were making it collectively. To enact that upon which his subjects have agreed cannot be unjust. To obey the sovereign is a prerequisite, is an essential condition of justice. Law is the sovereign's command, and justice requires obedience to the law if the subject's wishes are to be carried out. Unjust law is therefore a contradiction in terms. Now, what about bad law? Now, bad law can exist, where in making a law, the sovereign fails to exercise the protective functions on the basis of which the people have promised submission. That law may be considered bad, in that it is outside the purposes of covenant made by subjects with one another. The common peace and safety, which were the objectives of the covenant, are the touchstones of the laws made by sovereign. And if they are placed in peril, then the very purposes of the covenant are challenged. Now, Hobbes is essentially an authoritarian, if you see, and a supporter of absolute government. Now, the fear of anarchy and social violence has penetrated so much into heart that he became absolute authoritarian. Hence, his attitude to disobedience and rebellion stemmed from these principles. Now, he emphasized basically on that even though a law be considered unsatisfactory, this is not a matter for the people to judge lightly. It is not in itself a justification for general disobedience. The sovereign alone possesses the power to judge what needs to be done in the interest of his subjects. He must act on the basis of an exercise of that power. Now, to question the judgment of the sovereign is to revert to the anarchy of the state of nature, from which men had wished to be delivered. The duty not to question is part of the price and to be paid for social peace. Now, unsatisfactory laws are a matter between the sovereign and his God, not between him and his subjects. Now, if Hindus perceived that actions of their sovereign as contrary to divine injunctions, their obedience to the sovereign must not falter. Likewise, the church enjoys the legal status of any other corporation, and its subordination to the state was a necessary consequence of the principle of total submission which was required from all within the sovereign's realm. Now, there was to be no special privilege accorded to the church and its members. Now, Hobbes make it absolutely clear that when it has become obvious that a sovereign can no longer exert the power necessary to maintain the peace and to protect his subjects' safety, or when he has behaved in a manner which suggests unequivocally that his activities constitutes a clear attempt to destroy his subjects' rights of self-preservation, then the duty of obedience ceases. Now, he wrote in Leviathan that the obligation of subjects to the sovereign is understood to last as long and no longer than the power lasted by which he is able to protect them. Now, this is the sole condition relating to the sovereign's deployment of absolute power, and it constitutes a vital check upon the exercises of absolute authority by one who acts in opposition to the demands of common good. Now, with this, we'll come to the conclusion of Hobbes. Now, Hobbes, as if you can see, was terrified by the subjectiveness of human beings. So, he created a Leviathan, a supreme powerful being, and he becomes supremely powerful by the surrendering of rights, all over rights, to an entity known as state. And this state can exert power over its citizens when all citizens unequivocally obey that state. Now, if you can see the thesis of Hobbes' contract, somewhere lays out the foundation of positivism, legal positivism, and it demands for stability. Now, in next section, we will talk about law, and we'll try to talk about Rousseau's social contract. Thank you.